Okay, let's begin. Kum le'en Ablat Gemara. We're Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph and Masechta Beya. So we are up to about six lines at the top, and basically the discussion here is we have, just like we have Tchum Shabbos, we have Tchum Yom Tov. There's a limit how far you can walk. What about your objects? So we say that your objects, like your animals, can only walk the Tchum of their owner. And then if you gave it over to somebody before Shabbos, then whoever that new owner is, it's their Tchum. And we talked about if you gave it over to a shepherd. Then Shmuel says, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel came along and said, Shoir shel patum, a person who fattens up cows and oxen and all that in order to sell them. So the primary purpose of having these cows is to sell it to other people. And he knows that comes Yom Tov, people will come and purchase it. Shoir shel patum, hareu keragle kol adam. Anybody, doesn't matter from where they come from in the world. If somebody, let's say, is in a neighboring city, not even a member of your city, but they have it within the tchum, so they can walk over, or they made themselves a tchum. Since it's very common for people to come on Yom Tov to buy, it's as if you had in mind before Yom Tov, whoever ends up to be the owner, it's theirs all along. So therefore, whoever takes or buys the animal, it's the tchum of that new owner, even though it took place on Yom Tov, but the person who sold it already anticipated this happening prior to Yom Tov. But when it comes to a shepherd generally is not into selling so much. Mainly he's there to mind other people's sheep, or he raises his own sheep. Sometimes, occasionally he sells it. So he only really had in mind the locals. Somebody might need a last minute thing, but he doesn't think that people will travel from another city to him because they don't know for sure that he'll sell. Why would they make that trip on Yom Tov to walk that long distance? Only the people of the local city he anticipated maybe they'll come and buy, but he'd never had any idea that somebody from far away will come on Yom Tov to buy the animal from him. So therefore, the tchum will be like the shepherd. The Mishnah then said, if I borrow a keli from someone, but prior to Yom Tov, then it takes on the tchum of the borrower and not the lender. So obviously came Yom Tov, it was in the hands, it was the ownership of the borrower, so to speak. So of course it follows the tchum of the borrower. So we need in the case, we talked about it before Yom Tov. So all we did was dibur before Yom Tov, but the actual transaction took place on Yom Tov itself. So I would have thought, since the borrower did not take possession until Yom Tov itself, talking alone is not enough. Kamashlan, that talking is enough. So prior to Yom Tov, we spoke about that you're going to take the animal, it then sort of transfers ownership as far as Chum is concerned to the borrower, even though he physically picked it up on Yom Tov itself. Says Messiah Leah prove it to you or support the Rabbi Yechon show you if I borrow, if I organize with you to borrow something and I discuss it with you prior to Yom Tov, the actual transfer didn't take place until Yom Tov itself. It takes on the tchum of the borrower. Talking is enough. Then the Mishnah says, but be Yom Tov, if it all took place on Yom Tov, then keragel hamashal, it's like the lender. Now we're talking about talking. So when you tell me that it took place on Yom Tov, we're not talking about the transfer, but that was a previous case. So you're talking about that we didn't even start the discussions until Yom Tov proper. So therefore, prior to Yom Tov, it was the lenders. So that's why we followed the lender. See, what shit isn't that obvious? At the beginning of Yom Tov, it was the lenders. There was no borrower involved, no talking. So of course you follow the chum of the lender. We need the following case. The rogil generally, very occasionally, this person comes along on Yom Tov or Shabbat, whatever it is, and he borrows it from me. So therefore, I would have thought, even though we didn't speak about it, it's as if we spoke about it. I know that every Yom Tov you come to me and you borrow this. It's as if already before Yom Tov I anticipated you're coming tomorrow as well to borrow from me. And therefore, I already transferred it, as far as my thoughts are. It's already in the borrower's domain, so maybe we should follow the tchum of the borrower, kamashalan. No, because since every time you come over before Yom Tov, you say, I want to borrow this on Yom Tov, and this time you didn't. So Meimar Amma, the lender, thinks himself, maybe you found some other person, maybe the borrower found another person who, and he borrowed from that person. He's not planning to come to me at all, because he didn't come to me before Yom Tov. And therefore, maybe there's no transfer at all. And the Chiddush, and that's the Pshat in the Mishnah. That even though you come to me every Yom Tov, but because you didn't come this Yom Tov and we didn't speak about it, I didn't really anticipate you coming, so we followed Chum of the lender. Then the Mishnah continues. The Mishnah talks about if a woman borrowed from her friend spices and water and salt that she's going to repay the friend with. He's going to bring back after Yom Tov, and so on. So if the din is that it's considered as if the dough has a mixture of two owners and they overlap, and your tchum can only be with the far as they overlap. But Yehuda ignores the water, but everything else he does accept. So Gemara says, Kisolik Rab Abba, when Rab Abba made his trek to Israel, Amar, before he went to Israel, he said, Yehei Rabba, I wish the Ema Milsa de Tiskabel. I wish I can say something in Israel that they'll actually listen to me and they won't object to what I have to say. And definitely won't scoff what I have to say. When he finally arrived to Israel, Ashke, he found Rabbi Yechanan, and Rabbi Chanina, Bar Papi, and Abzeda, and others say. Rabavu, it's very hard to understand how Rabbi Yechanan is together with these two, but Rabavu and Rabbi Shimon Paziv, they were sitting there and they were asking the following question. This is the discussion they're having. Amai, why is it that we treat the dough, because it has some salt in it and some water in it, we treat as if they're two owners? Levatul mayim u'melech. So why don't we apply the rules of bittul, of nullification? And we normally say that if you have, batul b'shishim, why don't we say that the salt is completely nullified in contrast to the dough, and so to the water, and therefore the total owner now is the woman who owns the bar, the one who owns the dough, and the tchum should follow that owner. Why do we also still follow the owner of the spices or the salt? That was a question they asked. And therefore, we should ignore the tchum of the owner of the salt. Rab Abba said to them, Rab Abba's point is going to be, just because the salt is a minute amount, or the spices, or even the water, does that mean, therefore, that that person forfeits their ownership? We're talking about ownership here. Remember, it's a question of money, of ownership. Just because it's a very small part, therefore what? They're no longer the owner of it. And the person who has the majority is now allowed to eat the entire thing, and there's no other owner here. Why should, when it comes to ownership, be lost just because you're a very small partner? Abba said, let me ask you a question. What happens if one person has one kav of wheat that falls into a pile of 10 kavin of wheat of somebody else, another owner? So you're going to, according to your logic, you're going to tell me, well, 1 to 10 is nullified, is bottled. So the owner of the 10 now owns all 11. Yoichel Halal, the owner of the 10 now can eat all 11, and he is happy. Just because the guy only had one, therefore the ownership is gone, it just vanishes in the wind. And you want to say the same thing. You want to say that the salt and the water, the ownership should be gone, and therefore the tchum should only follow the dough. In the case of the wheat, are you going to tell me the ownership just dissipates or vanishes altogether? Of course not. So Gemara says, you have me a question, why is it bottled? Let's have a question, but that's not how it works. They all smiled at him. In other words, they sneered at him. He got very offended. He said, did I steal your shirt? What are you sneering at me for? What's that smirk? So what happened? They left him again, because Absafa didn't understand what they were trying to say. They thought his question was, his response was ludicrous. Rabbi Isha said, the people in Israel were right for mocking and smiling and laughing at Rabbi Vu's answer. Why were they right in Rabba's answer? Why were they right in mocking him? Because it's very simple. Rabbi himself should have known the answer. Why did he choose an example of wheat and wheat? Not, let's say, one person owned 1 kav of barley and another person owned 10 kavin of wheat, and that's the same question. So therefore, the owner of the barley vanishes. Why did he ask of a question dafka of wheat and wheat? Two similar things. So just to quickly remind you, we have a rule that min b'she'ein and mina. You have two different kinds of things that mixed together. We always follow the majority, or we go after shishim. The taste is totally nullified. But if it's min b'minute, two of the same min, we had an argument Rabbi Yehuda Chacham. The Chacham say it's also bottled, the same thing, b'roiv or b'shishim. But Rabbi Yehuda says min b'minute is not bottled. On the contrary, they reinforce each other. So wheat and wheat is min b'minute, and wheat and barley is min b'she'ein minute. So why did he choose dafka to talk about wheat and wheat and not about wheat and barley? I'll tell you why. Why did he not choose an example like Kamalu? We didn't choose an example of one guy owns wheat, one guy owns barley, and the guy with the barley is nullified. Why did he choose that as an example? And the owner of the wheat now is happy because the barley is nullified. Because in that case, he agrees that it is bottled. That the owner of the wheat now gets to keep the whole amount because it's bottled. He agrees. Min is bottled. Bottled. His problem was because chitin bechitin, when you have wheat and wheat, and therefore it's the same min, and therefore it's not bottled. The same thing over here. But the point is, who says that min b'min is not bottled? Only Rabbi Yehuda. But the halach is like a chamin, but min b'minoi is also bottled. So therefore, what's this question? It is bottled, yes. And over here, the question of these Amoraim is a valid question. Why don't we say that the water and the salt becomes bottled to the dough? After Shabbos, of course, you'll pay it back. But right now, in this dough itself, it is totally bottled. So chitin amin. He true that Rabbi Yehuda like bottle. Rabbi Yehuda taka holds is not bottle, but bottle. Rabban holds it is bottle. So therefore, they rejected Ababa's answer, and that's why they mocked him because he didn't answer the question at all. Our question is: the water and the salt should be bottled to the dough. Safra said to Rabbi Ishia, "You're defending these rabbis from mocking Rabbi Abba. I think Rabbi Abba has a very valid point." Moshe Shapik Amrit. He said, I swear in the name of Moshe, or Moshe, you're a person. You think you said the right thing? Well, didn't you hear the whole discussion? How the Amar Rabchia Ketusfa, Mashmei the Rav, what Rabchia Ketusfa said, name the Rav. Very interesting halacha. When you sell wheat, right? You sell, let's say, a kav of wheat. People expect that in the kav of wheat, you'll have a few pebbles, some extraneous products that are not really wheat, but it's all part of the kav, and that's people accept. So if a guy comes over and pulls out all the pebbles of the wheat, and now and gives it back to the person who owns the wheat, the person who owns the wheat just suffered a loss because when he was selling a kav of wheat before, it included these pebbles, and he got his full $100 for it, let's say. And now that you pulled out the pebbles, I got to give more wheat to get to that kav. So you cost me. So habayda tzreitis. And if somebody comes along thinking he's doing the right thing by pulling out all the pebbles and all these extraneous products from the wheat, the din is he has to actually pay him the value of those rocks in wheat. In other words, let's say he took away a quarter of a kav of pebbles and other things, he has to give this person back a quarter of a kav of wheat because that person now is going to sell the wheat. He's going to have to add a quarter of a kav of wheat to make up that full kav. Alma, what do we see from here? That kila chasre, because the measure doesn't matter the value. What value do rocks have? Zero. But because it's part of the measure of the kav, and you now caused him a loss, you now have to reimburse him, even though it has no value. So the same thing here. Water and salt, the waters are part of the measure, even though they have so little value. What value does water have? Nevertheless, they are equal value as the dough, and that is why it's not bottled. Just like the pebbles are not bottled even though it's a minority, it's not bottled in the wheat. So too, when it comes to ownership, it does not become bottled the water and the salt into the dough, and that's why it's considered a dough that has two owners, and the tchum is only where they overlap. Abaye turned around to the Safra and said, don't you know there's a difference between moment sheyesh le'tovin le'moment she'ein le'tovin? In the case of the wheat, the owner of the wheat has kindness to the person who came along and pulled out the pebbles. So he's taking the guy to Dintoida. He's demanding the guy to reimburse him. Okay, the fact that there's an owner there who demands reimbursement, that is why it's not bottled. But in our case over here, during Yom Tov, nobody's demanding reimbursement. The owner of the water and the salt is not demanding reimbursement. After Yom Tov, you have to pay me, but not from this water and salt, and I'm not demanding reimbursement during Yom Tov. So therefore, there's no tavin. There's nobody demanding any money. There's no tavin. Then the water and the salt should become bottled to the dough. On Malays, in other words, Abai is making a distinction between money that has someone claiming it, then we say it's not bottled, and money that has no one claiming it, it is bottled. On Malays, so back to Abai. So you're telling me, according to you, you're telling me there's nobody claiming it. Then even though it's monetary, it loses it becomes bottled. So you're saying it depends if there's a claim or not. Let me ask a question. Hodam Rav Chizah said an interesting law. We always look at the dominant factor, which is the roiv. So let's say you have here an avela, which is tamei, and you have a shchuta, shachtin kosher shchuta, which is not tamei. Remember, an avela can be metama a person and makes a rishon, but a shchuta, an avela metama kelim and so on. But a shchuta is at best it only becomes a rishon. So a shchuta can never become an avela. An avela is much more tummy than a shchuta. An avela is naturally tummy. A shchuta has to come in contact with tummy. So you have one piece of avela got mixed up with 10 pieces of shchuta, and you touch one of the meat, you don't know which one you touched. Do you become tummy or not? Or vice versa. There were 10 pieces of shchuta of nevela and one piece of shchuta, and you touch one of them. You don't know which one. What happened? So he says as follows: nevela betela b'shchuta. If you have 9 pieces of shchuta, 10 pieces of shchuta, and one piece of nevela, and then you touched it, the din is that you don't become tummy. You don't become tummy. And how is that? He says as follows: Nevela is bottled in the shchuta. You know why nevela is bottled shchuta? Because the dominant one here, which is the shchuta, vishi efsher l'shchuta shetas nevela. A shchuta can never become a nevela. What do you mean? Even if you touched it, if you take a shed and you put it on the shchuta, it'll never reach the level of an nevela. Never be an nevela. So therefore, it can never become bottled, and that's why the nevela therefore loses its identity, becomes like a shchuta. So if you touch it, you don't become tummy. However, shchuta ain't a betela. But what happens? Let's say you have 9 avelas and 1 shchuta. If you have 9 avelas and you have one shchuta, over here, when you touch one piece here, we say that an avela could become a shchuta. It's possible for an avela to become a shchuta if an avela, let's say, loses it becomes foul. It loses it's no longer considered a piece of meat. Then it's no longer tummy. It's no longer tummy. So it becomes like min b'minay. And therefore, because the vela can become a shchuta, a vela can become a shchuta, so the shchuta does not become bottled. The shchuta does not become bottled in the nevela because they're all the same, and therefore it becomes like a suffix tum. We don't say there's a vade tum here; it becomes a suffix tum. In other words, one of the pieces there is a shchuta. We don't say, oh, the shchuta is only 1 versus 9 versus 10, so the shchuta as if it disappeared. But because the shchuta, we're talking about according to Rabbi Yehuda here, holds min is not bottled. But when it comes to shchuta and nevela, in this regard, if the nevela is the majority, then the shchuta, both are considered min b'minay. In the case of if the shchuta is the majority and the nevela is the minority, it's min b'she'ena minay, and it's totally bottled. Why? Because the shchuta can never become a nevela. But in the case we have 9 nevelas and 1 shchuta, it's not treated like min b'she'ena minay. It's considered min b'minay. They're both the same. Why are they the same? Because the nevela over time can become like the shchuta, because if it goes off, it's foul. It's no longer considered a nevela. And therefore, since it's min b'minay, I feel about the bottom you holds. That means you have 10 pieces there, and 1 piece is kosher. You don't know which one. So now, when you touched it, you will become tambe, but not because of 100%, but a suffix. And what's the difference? The difference is if you touch truma, we won't burn the truma. We're going to say leave it in suspense because you cannot burn it because you don't know. The shchuta didn't disappear, but that becomes min b'minay. And nowhere do we make a difference whether there's an owner here, there's no owner here. But according to you, according to you, there should be a distinction. If there's somebody claiming it, it shouldn't become bottled, and so on. Because according to you, that's the critical factor. Is there a claimer, somebody claiming it? Therefore, even in the case of the one of the nevela and the shchuta, we say that it becomes bottled. But no, but according to you, if the nevela has an owner who might claim it, it shouldn't become bottled. Maybe it does. Who says it doesn't? Who says that there is no distinction between whether there's an owner claiming it or not? I'll tell you so. I'll prove it to you. But Tanya, that it doesn't matter whether there's an owner or not. But Tanya, we learned that an object that has no owner, let's say you found an animal on Yom Tov and belongs to nobody, the tchum that you can walk with this animal is not according to you, but according to the animal itself. So we see that even though there's no owner, it still has an identity. So really, it makes no difference if there is an owner, there is an owner. Whatever the din is, the identity, it has identity for it. It has no identity, it is bottled, it becomes bottled. And the fact that there's an owner or a claimant means nothing. Not having an owner is just like it has an owner. And therefore, we say that the animal, even though it's ownerless, the tchum is as if it owns itself, and therefore the tchum follows the animal. So it shows you clearly here, it makes no difference if there is an owner or there is an owner. So therefore, Rab Abba was correct in what he had to say. That the fact is, it took the water of the soul takes up as part of the measure of the dough, and there's an owner there. It doesn't matter claim they don't claim. There's an owner there, and therefore it shouldn't become bottled. And that's why the Mishnah says that you follow tchum both. Amalei Abai says back retorts, Mi kamedamid. What are you comparing isura l'mamayim? You're right. When it comes to tumah, isur bottle. When it comes to isurim, it is bottle. Bottle. When it comes to Isser, our question was the water of the soul for Isser Tchumin. Our question was the water of the soul should become bottled. And you bring me rayas for somebody selling wheat and the pebbles. That's dini mominus. Dini mominus have the fact that this person's ownership of the pebbles has a little value doesn't matter. There's an owner there, and therefore it never becomes bottled. Doesn't disappear. Just because it's a very minute amount doesn't make it disappear. But when it comes to Isurim, the laws are that it does disappear. That's our question. So how come when it comes to Tchum, which is a question of Isur, do we say that the owner of the water of the soul doesn't relinquish their ownership, and the Tchum also matters? Why? The time of my, so what's the reason? So we have 3 answers. Abai says, you know why? Gzeda, we are worried. Shema Tase Isa B'Shutras. We are worried that if we are going to say that in this case over here, the water of the salt, you can walk the tchum of the owner of the dough. We totally ignore the water and the salt. People will think there are 2 partners there, and yet it doesn't matter. We look at the main partner, for example, or each partner does whatever they want. So they'll think even if you have an outright partnership, that each partner can carry the object on Yom Tov according to their tchum. That they might make that mistake. So therefore, that's why the Chachamim made a takana that in the case of the dough, the same thing should apply. It's like partnership, and therefore it should be only where they overlap. Rava says, no, I'll give you another reason. Tabli, when it comes to spices, you know why it doesn't become bottled? L'taima avida. The purpose of spices is to give taste. L'taima le bottle, and taste does not become bottled. That explains the salt and the spices. It doesn't really explain the water. So Taisa says the reason why the water is not bottled, according to Rava, is because the water is very important. Because without the water, you can't have flour. You can't have dough. Just flour. So even though it's not because of taste, but when you're a catalyst and you the one that causes the whole compound to take place, you can't say, oh, it disappeared, and you wouldn't have dough. So that's reason number 2. And Rav Ashi says, you know why it's not bottled, the water and the salt? We should have it that tomorrow there's no laws of tchum, or you can eat the whole thing. Eat the whole thing today if you want. And the rule is anything which is permitted tomorrow or later, bottle never becomes bottle. And because it never becomes bottle, that's why we say that both tchumin here overlap. Let's just go to the Mishnah. Abuda said water is insignificant, and if the only thing that person lent you was water, then that person's tchum is irrelevant. It says Mayi means water, you're telling me disappears, but melech, like salt, doesn't disappear. Why? But Tanya, we learned that Rabbi Yehuda himself said that water and salt are both bottled. Bain be'isa, bain big data. He said they are both bottled, whether it's in a cooked item or whether it's in a dough, because they're so insignificant. So not only water, he also argues regarding salt. How come our Mishnah only mentions Rabbi Yehuda's opinion regarding water? The salt also should be bottled according to Rabbi Yehuda. This is the salt that we're worried about for my machareni, because they go into your eye and they can blind you. This is very, very, very fine salt. That's why it's possible for them to get stuck between your fingernails or something, and therefore can blind you. And the haba melech is draconis. So if you have like kosher salt, big pieces of salt, they don't become bottled, and that's the case of our Mishnah. That's why we only argue about water. There's Bryson when it talks about salt, that it becomes bottled from a very fine flour, melech damis, a very fine salt, but becomes bottled. The Tanya Gemara we learned elsewhere that water and salt betailing be'isa, they become bottled in the dough, but the ein betailing b'gdata, they don't become let's say water does not become bottled when it comes to a cooked item. Because you see all the gravy and you can see it. In the dough, the water is absorbed in the dough. You don't see anything at all. But in the cooked item, in the gravy, you see right there all the water. And our Mishnah seems to say that the water is bottled. The Mishnah doesn't make a distinction between dough or a cooked item. According to Yehuda, the water is always bottled. And the Brisa says that water in a cooked item is not bottled. Says the Gemara, and how do we know we're talking about cooked items as well? We're talking about spices. Spices generally is only used in cooked items. They don't use it on bread. So l'chayda has a steer between the Brisa and the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, like Kash, it's not a problem. How about the our Mishnah is talking about, which is very, very thick, thick mixture, so you don't really see the water at all. The water is all absorbed. Therefore, the water is bottled. And over here, when it says the Brisa, the water not bottled, habaraka. Here it's talking about the water is very fluidy and there's a lot of gravy there, and therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says the water is not bottled because it's visible to the eye. Okay, everyone should have a good Shabbos tomorrow night. I think.